I'm Arnaud Lauret. I'm French, so I speak with my delicious Franglish accent. You may also know me as API Handyman. That's my Twitter handle and the name of my blog. I joined Postman last February. I'm working in the Open Technologies team led by Kin Lane, and we are a bunch of people which are, let's say, API nerds, and we aim to help people understand the API world, and we also aim to promote the use of API specifications. Like Josh, I wrote a book with the same publisher, which is titled The Design of Web APIs, and it is obviously about the design of web APIs. It has been translated from English to Japanese, Korean, Russian, and there is a Chinese version in progress, I think. I forgot to request discount codes to my publisher, but you can go to my website and you will find one that works for any Manning book. A few words about the title and the visual style of this presentation, because it may not be understandable by everyone, because it's a bit old. I'm old, so it's inspired by an advertisement made by Sega in the 90s. Genesis does what Nintendon't. So it was because in the 90s there was the rivalry between Sega and Nintendo, and so there was that advertisement. So let's see if OpenAPI does what Swagger don't. Before diving in the comparison of the two formats, let's talk about history. Where do those two specifications come from? So and I have to read my notes because I never remember the dates. In 2011, the team running the Warnick Online Dictionary was struggling with the generation of API documentation and SDKs. So they created a set of library and tool called Swagger, especially a UI for documentation called Swagger UI, which was powered by a JSON document, which was not really important at that time. In 2014, Swagger 2 was released with the Swagger editor that put the Swagger 2 specification up to the front. Personally, it was exactly at that time that I was looking for something that would allow me to describe APIs before their implementation. In 2015, the Swagger 2 specification was donated to a new organization called the OpenAPI Initiative, which operates under the Linux Foundation. And so the specification became the OpenAPI specification, the Swagger brand and tools staying the propriety of SmartBear. So that means it's not Swagger versus OpenAPI. It's Swagger then OpenAPI. OpenAPI 3 is just the new version of Swagger 2. These are not competing specifications. And there are currently two versions of OpenAPI 3, the 3.0, which was released in July 2017, and the 3.1, which was released 4 years later in 2021. Nowadays, tools usually support version 2 and version 3.0. 3.1 support is arriving slowly but surely. And the discussion about the next version v4 is starting, so you can go to the OpenAPI specification GitHub repository and participate to the discussion. So let's see how OpenAPI 3 improves Swagger 2. So it improves it in different domains: the structure of the document itself, the description of hosting, security aspects, and the API contract, and last but not least, documentation. First, structural modification, which is not an improvement, but a consequence of changing the name of a specification. I could talk about that specific topic for hours, but I will not. But changing name is usually not a good idea. So the Swagger property, which was holding the version of the specification used, has been renamed OpenAPI. Not that you should not confund it with the version of the API you are describing, which is located in info.version. And by the way, if you create a format, it's really a good idea to put an information inside the document to say, hey, this is version whatever of that format. Spectral, I'm looking at you. So in Swagger 2, the root level contains some properties holding reusable components and actual components. So leading sometimes to a misunderstanding. Do something defined in parameters applies to all operation in the API described in the document? No. So in OpenAPI 3, all reusable components have been moved to a new property called components. Not that the definitions property that was holding the reusable JSON schema has been renamed schemas. In Swagger 2, only request and response bodies were described the same way with JSON schema. Query parameters or response headers were defined differently. In OpenAPI 3, any piece of data is described with JSON schema the same way. So either a query parameter or response body, you will describe them the same way. That facilitates the job of API designers, and it facilitates the creation of consistent APIs. Defined once, use anywhere. For instance, you may use a path, you may define a path parameter, which will hold, let's say, a resource ID, and you can use the exact same schema to define the property ID of your schema defining the whole resource. In Swagger 2, JSON schemas, parameters, response, and definitions were reusable. In OpenAPI 3, you can now reuse examples and response headers. Note also that security definitions has been renamed security schemes. In Swagger 2, to provide information about where the API is exposed, you can use 3 different properties located at the root level of the document: schemes, hosts, and base path. When you put them all together, you have a URL. In OpenAPI 3, those 3 different properties have been replaced by servers, which can hold not one, but as many as you wish server properties, each one having a description. And note that the URL can be a relative one, and so may hold the same information you would have put in the base path in Swagger 2. That is useful to, for instance, propose a different URL for mock versus real API, and it may also be used by API gateway configuration to say, hey, this is the server URL you will use in front of the gateway, and you will actually re-expose the backend, which is located this way. Not that if you use OpenAPI for that, you may have to remove the backend server URL in order to show it to consumers, because people should not be aware of the URL inside your systems. In Swagger 2, the exposition URL is defined once and for all. In OpenAPI 3, you can redefine it at any path level, if you wish. And if multiple servers are not enough, you can define variables in URL. Regarding security, OpenAPI 3 does not bring heavy structural changes, besides security definitions being moved into components and renamed security schemes, but some security modes have been slightly modified, I would say fixed, enhanced or added. So basic authentication is replaced by a new HTTP mode, which covers basic authentication and bearer tokens. By the way, I do not recommend using basic authentication nowadays. API key was supporting query header and header location in Swagger 2. In OpenAPI 3, you can use cookies. Again, API keys and cookies may rhyme with APIs in French, but I would not recommend to use them. There is a better OAuth 2 support, especially now the names of the OAuth modes match the original spec. Because in Swagger 2, you had to make a kind of conversion. It was complicated. And some URL were missing differently depending on the mode you were using. It has been fixed. Now you can also define security using OpenID Connect. And OpenAPI 3.1 brings something that any people working in corporate environment needs, mutual TLS. Let's talk about data. Several sessions could be done on that pure topic, data definition. We'll try to make it short. What is really important with OpenAPI 3 is that you get a newer, at that time, version of JSON Schema. You move from draft 4 to draft 5. That brings keywords such as one-off, any-off, not. There is also the write-only property. So there was a read-only. So you define a schema. You can say this property will be only used for a get operation. That's what it means. With 3, you can still say that. You can also say, hey, this attribute will only be used for a write operation, so a post or a patch. That allows to define a single schema in the request and the response. In 3.1, you can use 2012 version of JSON Schema, which brings many new possibilities. But more than that, you can use other version of JSON Schema. So if you have pre-existing old JSON Schema, you don't want to move them to the latest version, you can still use OpenAPI 3.1. That feature really makes the format future-proof, because in the future, if there are new versions of JSON Schema, they can be integrated in the spec easily. But easily for the spec, the tools will have to be upgraded to understand the new version of JSON Schema. In Swagger 2, you could define which media type were consumed or produced by the API or an operation. The problem was, and is, that you could not define which were the data models of each format. With OpenAPI 3, this problem is solved. You can define the schema for each content type. And so it's a pity Eric is not there, because, for instance, you can say, hey, here's the format, the schema for application JSON, or here's the format for application/linkset plus JSON. In 2.0, only arrays could be serialized in query parameters or headers. In 3, you can serialize objects using style and explode. For people who are familiar with especially PHP framework, that's pretty useful. Last but not least, regarding the contract definition, with the addition of webhooks and callbacks, which were completely not supported in Swagger 2. So what lies behind those two different concepts is the idea of reverse API. An API which is defined by the provider, but implemented by the consumer, and that will be called by the provider. So in 3.0, the callback definition has been added to operations, and it allows to define a reverse operation that will be called by the provider once a long operation has been processed, for instance. In 3.1, there are webhooks that are introduced, so you define them at the root of the document. So these are reverse operations that can be called at any time by the provider, independently from any prior API call made by the consumer. Documentation. In 2.0, you could define an example for a request or response body, but only one example, and you cannot describe it. In 3.1, there is still example, but there is a new examples which allow to define multiple examples and document them, providing summary, description, and obviously the value. And the value, if it's too complicated, too big, or whatever, can be put elsewhere thanks to external value. Note that there is a trick in Swagger 2 to define multiple examples. You can take advantage of, so when you define an example in Swagger 2, you have to say for which content type it is. You can hack the content type to put whatever you want, a summary, for instance, and then the example. It's ugly, but it works. regarding the text descriptions, 3.0 introduced summary and descriptions at path level, which is interesting. And 3.1 added a summary at the info level. This one, I like this one because succeeding to define a good summary of your API helps to define its boundaries, like its name. And that's really good. Also, I've been working on creating an internal API catalog, and I was struggling by deciding which part of the description will be shown in the list of all API, and so having a summary is quite useful. Okay, so all these new features are really cool. So use OpenAPI 3 now. I get all of these exclusive new features for free. Well, almost for free, because it's not free to move from Sega 2 to OpenAPI 3. The ideal path to upgrade will be to check the compatibility of any third-party tools you are using. So 3 or 4 years ago, it was a little bit complicated. Nowadays, moving almost all third parties are supporting 3.0. If they are not, maybe it's time to look for other third parties. You may also have to look at your custom tools, because we all build custom tools processing Swagger or OpenAPI files. And once everything is upgraded, you convert your existing document, because you do not lose anything. And there are many converters that will do the job for you, and you are ready to go. So that's the idealistic path. Unfortunately, we do not live in an ideal world. Sometimes it's complicated to upgrade all tools at the same time. And so personally, what I had to deal with was, I was in an environment where we had some tools supporting 3 and some other tools supporting version 2 only. So we decided still to say, okay, now in our API first approach, some team may, if they wish, use version 3 of the spec. They will have to downgrade their document to version 2 with the specific tool that only supports 2, and they can use version 3 with the tool that supports it. So in our case, it was simple because the documentation tooling was supporting 3, and our gateway was only supporting 2. So we just carefully did not use any advanced JSON schema stuff, but actually our gateway was not using it, so it was not a huge problem. So the strategy is really, okay, what is my ecosystem? What I am using, what do I want to use in the spec? Where it is used in my ecosystem, and choose the functionality that way. That can help to speed up adoption of version 3, and in parallel, you can move your tools to support version 3. But beyond that, there is a question. How to globally, in general, it's not only an open API only problem, it's an API specification problem. How to speed up adoption? How to help people avoid waiting? In my case, I had to wait almost 4 years before being able to move to OpenAPI 3. So how to speed up adoption? One important thing, I believe that, so again, it's not OpenAPI only problem. There will be no adoption if there are no tools that support the new version of the spec. It's obvious. And the problem is also reverse. The adoption will be slow, or there will be no adoption if tools do not get help. For instance, it's complicated to support multi-part OpenAPI specification. It's really complicated to manage the distributed reference and so on. So everyone creating a tool has to create its own solution and so on. So we should find ways to collectively avoid everyone losing time reinventing the wheel. We should find ways to lower the barrier to integrate specification, and especially new version of specification, into any tool. So that means I believe that specification creators should provide basic tools, demonstrating at least how it works, a kind of proof of concept. Maybe bootstrapping the supporting tool. Maybe providing a tool that is actively supported and production ready. And also, I think that software vendors should work together and invest in the creation of shared open source libraries that everyone can use, including themselves. Because the less there's work to support a spec in a tool, the better for everyone. Faster new version support, the new version brings new features into the tools, and vendors or open source creators can innovate based on that. And that brings a better adoption. Extra slide had it based on a discussion I had this at noon about evolving APIs. Maybe the best way to speed up adoption of a new version is not doing a new version. Yeah, really. So again, it's not only an open API concern, it's a concern for any spec. Do we need change? Do we need that evolution? Do we need this new version? What does it bring? What does this feature bring? Maybe we don't need it. Maybe the community does not need it. And maybe this spec is not the place to have that new feature. Maybe we should create another spec, which may evolve independently. And we can, the end user, when they need them, they can use those two specs together. Also, another question I had in mind regarding that is, do we need to change fast? API specifications are in the middle of everything. So the cost of change is really high for everyone. So maybe we can adopt a slow pace. Actually, for OpenAPI, that was the case. There were at least, I think, 3 to 4 years between different versions, so not that fast. For JSON Schema, for instance, I think it's quicker. So maybe we can evolve slowly. And last question that comes to my mind regarding this topic is, do we really need to introduce non-backward compatible change? Maybe we should learn to live with errors from the past and just add and live with errors as long as possible. That's actually my motto regarding API evolution. Create your first version of API, make it live as long as possible until you have learned more about your domain, add. In the end, it may be ugly, but it will work. And maybe after a long time, you may say, okay, we have a really new feature which will interest everyone, so maybe it's time to break things. Maybe not. So I do not have the answers to this question, but I think that is something we should think about, because the impact of the ecosystem is so huge that sometimes it may be counterproductive to provide evolution for the sake of evolution. So, besides that, what is really important nowadays is really, if you are using Swagger 2, it's really time to move to OpenAPI 3, at least 3.0. Your world will never be the same. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes?
What is the upgrade path from 3.0 to 3.1?
What is what?
The upgrade path from 3.0 to 3.1.
I understand the last part, but not the middle. What is the what from 3.0 to 3.1?
Upgrade path.
Upgrade from 3.1. Upgrade from 3 to 3.1.
Oh, what is the upgrade? Basically, webhooks. I think that's the most part of it, the descriptions. So most of the modifications brought by 3.1 are backward compatible. They maybe have some little change here and there, but it's, yeah, you can move safely. The only problem with 3.1 is really the tool support. And we go back to the discussion of how do we promote adoption. I hope I answered the question. Another question? Yes?
So, I want to ask the same question you put on the slide, the reusable version of the API, right?
Yeah.
From your perspective, the current version 3.1, do you see anything missing, anything wrong with it? Will drive us to 4.0?
Oh, there are missing things because people are creating extensions, people are hacking the spec, there are errors, for instance, headers. Headers, yes, in 3.0 you can reuse headers, but unfortunately headers are defined with key header. So when you reuse your header, you are losing the key, so you are losing the header name, which makes no sense. From my API designer, it's on my t-shirt, perspective, it's ugly, it should be fixed, but maybe we should learn to live with error from the past. So there are many discussions about 4.0 is really, okay, let's get rid of all the past, fix all errors, and everything will be great. So on one side, I'm, yes, that's interesting. Let's break everything. On the other side, hey, we are already struggling with 3.1 support, so we have to find a balance. But maybe if we create version 4, it's time to provide the tooling that will help people to adopt it in a faster way. So yeah, it's, I think for the discussion was really radical change and address issues that were not addressed in the past, and also add new features. But again, adding new features in OpenAPI or any specification, my question is always, is it the right place? Or should it be put elsewhere? Mehdi Medjari presented his study on terms of service to make them machine readable. And there is the question, where do we put that? Inside OpenAPI, outside? I'm more on the outside team, because that way we have specs that can live together, can be used together, and maybe the terms of service spec can be used in other specs. So it's really a question of separation of concerns and being, let's say, let's talk about micro specifications. Other question? Yes?
I'm curious, don't you believe that vendors can buy into the representation process, thinking of libraries like Phantasy,
Yeah, so the question is how vendors are implicated in the upgrade of the spec. I have absolutely no clue. What I have seen is that there are, I will not say good, there are vendors who are faster than others. And both actually are OAI members. So I'm not in OAI. My company is a member of OAI. So I don't know how all this thing works, but what I see is that some are slower than others. So maybe some have more money than others and can spend more money on supporting the ecosystem. So I think it comes to that. And that's why I believe that if all vendors work together to help to put up an open source, an independent open source project to avoid bike shading for everyone, it will be better for everyone. Other questions? No? Thank you very much.